And I would, on behalf of New York Law School, I would also like to thank you for coming. This event is very important to us as a community. And under Anthony Crowell's leadership, it's one of the forms of outreach that I think is very important to our school and enriching the lives of all members of this community. So you've no doubt been reading the newspaper and hearing the news. Every day brings us a new challenge, I think I could say. And it's a little hard with so much going on to be focused. So what we're doing today is we're going to be focusing on a particular set of issues that have been emerging for both secular and faith-based not-for-profits. And hopefully our discussion will both give you some insights and maybe some concrete information. We have a wonderful panel of, I guess, four tax lawyers and a rabbi. What could be better? And I'm going to introduce.
I have to say, I don't think I've ever been on a panel like this in my life. It's very exciting.
So I'm going to introduce folks just very briefly about myself. I do teach tax law here at New York Law School. I also direct our graduate tax program. And I also serve as the board chair of a racial and gender justice think tank. So what can I say? I feel your pain. Okay, so first, Tiffany Carter, who is the Public Policy Director and Counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits. I think she'll tell us a little bit more about what you all do. But many of your organizations, I think, are members. I think there are 3,000 members, something like that. In addition, Musa Jemal, who's here on my right, who is a tax attorney in private practice in New York and an active member of the Muslim Bar Association in New York and New Jersey, both. Okay. Ben Leff, here's Ben, is also a tax professor and he is at American University's Washington College of Law in Washington, D.C. And here on my left is Rabbi Sharon Kleinbaum, who is the senior Rabbi Emerita at Congregation Beit Simchat Torah. Sorry.
It's okay. That's just torture. It's just torture.
No, I'm actually
CBST. That's what
yeah, CBST. I'm actually Jewish, so I'm really embarrassed.
Doesn't matter. It's still torture.
So this congregation, I think, is the largest LGBTQ and perhaps the oldest in the United States.
There's one 3 months older. There's a lot of competition there.
Okay. And she will be bringing us some perspectives from obviously a faith-based organization. Okay, Tiffany, ready to go? Okay,
Hi,
so
everybody.
okay.
Can you hear me? Is that I don't know if I'm having, we're good. Okay. Well, thanks for having me. Sorry I'm not in person, but I think the intro, if there was 4 tax lawyers and a rabbi walking into the law school, that would be a start of a pretty good joke. So we'll spare everyone from that. But yes, I am the public policy director and counsel at the National Council of Nonprofits. I've been here for about 9 years. And we represent 501c3s across the country. We have 2 state associations in New York, and we have about 30,000 members across the country. We probably have a couple thousand just in New York alone. So we deal with issues that affect the nonprofit sector as a whole, but just 501c3s within the tax exempt code. And I know we're covering a lot of things today. So starting with nonprofit nonpartisanship on the Johnson Amendment, I know that we have a lot of experts on this panel that address it. We see this as kind of the fundamental core of what 501c3s are. We are mission-based and not in partisan politics. We are nonpartisan under the law and in fact and in purpose. And there's been some attacks on removing nonprofit nonpartisanship under 501c3 over the last few years. Specifically in 2017, they tried to remove that portion of the tax code in the 2017 tax law. So with that being said, we're seeing a lot of different factors in DC. DC is wild right now. That's why Ben and I couldn't leave to come up there. But, we're seeing a lot of factors from all 3 branches of government. And this provision under 501c3 being one in the legislative branch, but we're actually seeing attacks from the executive branch on it as well. Within the legislative branch, we're also seeing a lot of issues coming out on ways that the legislature is trying to remove some kind of tax exemption or specifically target different subsectors within 501c3. That's where HR 9495 comes in, provisions dealing with immigration services or who gets to decide, where, what is charitable, and, who gets to decide if you're actually working in and supporting terrorism. What does that mean? Where's the, what's defined as that? So these are different things that have popped up over the last few years. This year, between HR 9495 and the 25 tax law, which is extending or looking to extend the 2070 tax provisions, there's a lot of additional ways that they're looking at different provisions and different groups under 501c3. Things like hospitals, removing tax exemption for hospitals, removing tax deductible donations for health clinics, increasing endowment tax and excise tax on endowments for higher ed. Like, these are a bunch of different factors that we're seeing play out. And that's just in the legislative branch. In the executive branch, we have seen President Trump sign over 90 executive orders already. I believe he's looking to sign another couple this afternoon, which will keep us busy. And there's over 100 lawsuits on those 90 executive orders. We have 2 out right now, and I believe that's what I'm actually supposed to be talking about. So our 2 lawsuits are dealing with federal funding. Nonprofits earn about a third of revenues across the board, across the country, from grants and contracts at all 3 levels of government. And about a quarter of nonprofits receive federal funding. So on January 27th, Office of Management and Budget, which is kind of the infrastructure of the federal government, came out with a memo that was requiring all agencies to temporarily pause all federal funding. This is equivalent to about $3 trillion of federal funds coming out of the federal government. And they wanted to freeze it within 24 hours, actually within 22 hours, which, as I just mentioned, that is a huge amount of money that actually goes to nonprofits to partner with government and provide vital services on the ground, probably services that you in the room actually provide every day. So we filed a lawsuit. We were very happy to get an administrative stay 3 minutes before that memo was supposed to go into effect, but we already saw the negative and adverse effects of this funding be stopped. Fast forward, we're now in a preliminary injunction with that, which we're very happy about, but we were hearing about more funding streams that were still turned off, namely under the Inflation Reduction Act and the Infrastructure Investment and Jobs Act, really affecting environmental groups, energy groups, and kind of that subsector. And so we filed a second lawsuit last Thursday, and we're asking for a preliminary injunction there too. So that was a lot of information in a very short period of time. But I know that we have a lot more time to kind of dig into the details, and we have an excellent panel. So I'll turn it back over to you.
All right. Thank you very much, Tiffany. So that's kind of the broad spectrum. I'm going to ask Musa to bring us a little bit more granularly into what's being called HR 9495, this so-called anti-terrorism legislation that fortunately did not pass in the last Congress. I don't think it's been reintroduced yet, but
yeah, I think it's been reintroduced again in the Senate now.
So it's in the Senate now? I didn't find it in Congress.gov. There you go. Okay, Musa.
Okay, so we're gonna get into the nitty-gritty here. But before we go, too deep into the mechanics, I'd like to take a step back and just kind of look at what the law in fact does. And then we'll get back into the mechanics. So the proposed law creates serious tax liabilities for charitable organizations at both the federal and at the state level. At the federal level, immediately upon revocation of the tax exempt status, any contributions to the organization are no longer deductible. The organization itself immediately becomes taxable on its income, on any excise or other taxes or penalties at the point of losing that exemption. And it also might be, subject to corporate income tax and have other filing tax return requirements. At the state level, also its rights and obligations will be implicated. Specifically looking at, the state of New York, for example, the revocation of the federal tax exemption under 501p, which is where this proposed bill is going to be inserted in, will strip any organization's exemption for all state administered taxes, fees, and imposition. And it's going to be looking back retroactively to the entire tax year of the organization. And then it'll also look prospectively forward for personal income taxes, corporate franchise taxes, and it may also mandate collection of taxes on post revocation sales. And if with the sale, there hasn't been a withholding, the purchaser can also be liable. So that's what the law does in fact. And we're going to talk a little bit now about the mechanics of how it accomplishes that. So the proposed law is consequential, and if enacted, it will revoke tax exempt status for charitable organizations that are deemed, okay, just straight up, just deemed by the Secretary of the Treasury to have provided support to designated terrorist groups. The bill defines terrorist supporting organization as any organization designated as having provided during the 3-year period prior to its designation. Material support here is anything that is above a certain excess minimum amount, and also is broadly interpreted to include not just monetary contributions, but tangible aid. And on the debate in the House of Representatives, they also said intangible, but that's not what the law says, but who knows how it might be interpreted. It also includes legal training and political advice. And the mental state that is required, okay, here is not specific intent to further any organization's terrorist activities, but simply knowledge that that organization has some sort of connection to terrorism. So in that sense, it's very broad. So the proposed bill gives the Secretary of the Treasury power and complete discretion to review any tax-exempt organization's pre-enactment conduct within the 3-year look-back period ending on the designation date. So as soon as the proposed bill becomes law, effectively at that point, the Secretary of the Treasury can start to investigate any organization, and not prospectively, but they can take into effect past conducts for 3 years, which includes, that's a lot of liability for organizations to have to think back now, if the law passes today, what have they been doing for the last 3 years that could be construed as providing material support. So that's for imposing the loss of the exemption, but the liability itself is imposed after the designation date and after the enactment. So it apply prospectively to conduct. So once there has been a designation of terrorism related designation, the organization then will receive 90 days to contest that designation. And some of the ways that it can be rescinded is if it was made erroneously, the designation itself, or if the organization didn't get a notice. The disputes are going to be with the Internal Revenue itself. So the IRS Independent Office of Appeal is going to hear the dispute as if the IRS made the determination, which could be problematic also because You know, there's confidential information. How much of that is the IRS going to get? How much due process will organizations be able to contest what's being put forward? And then the United States District Court will have exclusive jurisdiction to review the final determination with respect to the organization's designation as a terrorist supporting group. And then just a quick historical fact, you know, the Internal Revenue Section 501P was the same section that the Republicans gave Obama such a hard time about, saying that he was weaponizing the IRS to go after innocent tax-exempt organizations. But here, it's broad. The expansion is very broad, and it gives the secretary a lot of discretion.
Wow. Thank you. I just want to add just a tiny note that Newman over there reminded me that one of the things that a tax exempt organization loses when it loses its tax exemption is the local real property tax exemption, which can be a pretty big piece. Okay, thank you. So now I'm going to ask Ben to talk to us a little bit about the so-called Johnson Amendment. Tiffany referred to it a little bit, and what's going on. There's a challenge underway in the courts to, I guess, neutralize it. So can you give us a little more information, Ben?
Yeah, sure. And thank you so much for having me and for structuring this so I can participate remotely. I really appreciate it. I want to use most of my time actually to kind of step back a little bit and frame things, and then try to get into the weeds with the what I used to call the campaign intervention prohibition. Now the term Johnson Amendment has taken over, and either one works for me. So anyway, just to step back a little bit, you know, at the heart of the Johnson Amendment, but also so many other laws related to the nonprofit sector, there's this tension between the fundamental building block of the nonprofit sector, which is to have some independence from government action, and the whole structure of our nonprofit sector is dependent on the idea that independence that the nonprofit sector has is a value that creates sort of, in some ways, another check on government power. And it's really the First Amendment, you know, if you think from a constitutional perspective, what protects this independence, it's really the First Amendment that's protecting this independence. But it's infused into the whole legal structure of the nonprofit sector as this value of nonprofit independence. And then on the other side, obviously, because the nonprofit sector, in effect, receives a subsidy just by being a nonprofit, the legal structure tries to control the kinds of benefits that flow out, and they're trying to control those benefits flowing to certain types of organizations that advance certain social goods. So there's a tension between the control on the subsidies and the independence of the nonprofit sector. And again, these are either First Amendment issues literally, that is in the courts, or their First Amendment values that are infused into it. So the big heading that the Johnson Amendment falls under from a legal perspective is this doctrine called unconstitutional conditions. And unconstitutional conditions basically says when the government wants to advance its own mission, it can use its funds to do that. It can fund organizations that say what the government wants to say. When it's kind of hiring people to say what it wants to say, it can do that, no problem. What it can't do is take away constitutionally protected rights, like the rights to have an opinion, in order to receive a general subsidy. So it can't condition things like nonprofit status or all sorts of other broader government subsidies on the organizations complying with the government's view of a particular thing. It has to do it in a way that is content neutral, basically. And that's true of the built-in subsidies in nonprofit status. So what we always worry about is this dance between the government wanting to use the nonprofit subsidies in order to kind of coerce the nonprofit sector to advance the government's position or share the government's views and the independence that's required under the law. And it's a pretty subtle game a lot of the time. So like, great unconstitutional cases, unconstitutional conditions cases in the past include like the Russ v. Sullivan, I mean, not Russ v. Sullivan. Well, anyway, so Johnson Amendment is a particular example of that. And just to kind of differentiate my view a little bit from the way that Tiffany described it, all nonprofits have a First Amendment protected right to have their views and express them. And most importantly, among those views are views about the qualifications of candidates for office. So first, the nonprofits, notwithstanding the structure of the law, have a right to have views about whether a candidate is bad or good. They have a right to express that view, and that's contained in a Supreme Court case, an old Supreme Court case that's actually about lobbying called Regan versus Taxation with Representation, that tries to construct what the balance is. How can a 501c3 organization both have a constitutionally protected right to have a view about a candidate, and how can we have this regulatory structure that prevents the nonprofit sector from, in effect, turning into a financial funnel for campaign contributions? Like, how do we get that balance right? Regan versus Taxation with Representation is the case that kind of tells us how to do that. And then there's a case now also pretty old, it's from 2000, from the DC Circuit called Branch Ministries versus Rosati that applies that to campaign intervention. And that space, the space of balancing the government's kind of right to use its money to do what it wants to do, and the need to protect the independence of the nonprofit sector, including to have views that are very threatening or potentially very threatening to whatever the administration is. That's kind of the space that we're in right now. I actually used up all my time, so I'll talk about the particular case later if it's relevant. Thanks.
Okay, thank you very much, Ben. We'll come back to that in a couple of minutes. So, Rabbi Sharon, from the perspective of a faith leader, what are you seeing in terms of impact of all of this? I guess lawyers would call it chilling discussion and threats of changes in law. In particular, your congregation is well known for its progressive social justice commitments. Are you seeing any impact there?
Thank you so much. And it's really wonderful to be here. And I think we all know how important it is to blur lines between professional expertise and be able to speak with and among each other to deepen where we all sit. And so I'm very grateful to be here. And I think there's a basic tension that all faith leaders experience if they're in a synagogue, mosque, church, temple setting, which has a 501c3 status, which is we are trained to speak in prophetic voices. We are trained, and it is in our souls and hearts to be able to speak truth to power. And we are also then given the terror of our boards of directors or vestries or other to make sure we don't do anything that threatens that nonprofit status. And in each denomination and every one of our professional associations issues guidelines, because that is that tension, that is that panic that exists. Will the rabbi, will the priest, will the minister, will the imam say something that will threaten that 501c3 status? And since nobody in that conversation is in fact the tax attorney, everybody pontificates about what would threaten that and what is acceptable. So that's a whole field unto itself of how people who know nothing can speak at great length. But that's another problem of religion. But so there's always the tension for faith leaders about what can we say? And then there are the lay leaders in the congregation who are taking notes very carefully, and they come back to us. So there's that tension that exists. So as it has been interpreted, which is to say, and this is very interesting, Ben, and I'd love to hear more about this when we get back to that conversation, that endorsement is out of the question in electoral politics, but taking clear positions on legislative, social, cultural issues is totally acceptable. Now, the problem we have as faith leaders in communities is that there's both the legal issues, but then there are the cultural issues that for some communities of faith, anything political is off is not acceptable. So, and for some communities, anything that's political is very, very welcome. And some of it is historical and cultural, and some of it is of this moment. So the Johnson Amendment itself, I would say 99.9% of clergy would not know what it was if you said those words, that phrase, but they know what their boards of directors say to them about what they can't say. And it absolutely, following this process, you know, by which Trump in Trump 1.0 issued his statements that, as we understood it, really started to chip away at the power of the Johnson Amendment by constantly talking about exactly what you said, the freedom of speech of religious institutions. In particular, I'm not sure if those were directed to all 501c3s or to religious institutions, what his statements were about.
I think initially it was about religious
I think that's how I
institutions. Yeah.
understood it. That was originally about, let's release basically the right-wing churches to have the freedom to do what they want to do. But I would say the chilling effect that's happening in progressive communities is a terror that somehow anything that the rabbi, minister, priest, imam says is going to threaten that 501c3 status. And with that elimination of that status comes the entire financial base. And as you mentioned, sir, the issue about property tax. If most of these churches, synagogues, mosques, temple have to pay property tax, that alone will sink many, many institutions. Separate from the issue about whether the donations themselves will be affected. So the question for me has always been, and also in teaching this to other clergy, and is to encourage people to be able to take strong political positions and to stay away from the issue of I endorse or I reject issue. And that remains very uncomfortable for people. And I would say, to answer your question directly, absolutely a huge chilling effect. And the anxiety that people have in our communities that this will be threatened is very, very scary. Because most of our communities, the world from which I come, they're not the ones that Trump wants to empower, how shall we say, or encourage to
Don't think
speak.
so.
Right. And they don't realize that what there will be. And a big question, of course, that comes up as well is once the 501c3 is challenged, and this is another implication, then of course, the question then becomes, are donors to a synagogue, church, mosque, or temple, do they become more reportable than they currently are? That itself will be a big chilling effect as well. That issue about how public those lists of names would be. I want to say one more thing before we open this up to the conversations, is that this tension between free speech and for what clergy feel is our responsibility to speak truth to power, and the tension of being exactly at the intersection of what you discussed, which is getting a benefit from the state of this nonprofit status, and at the same time chafing against it because of our religious traditions and what it calls upon us to do, is at the heart of where that tension exists. And few people are well equipped to actually be able to interrogate that tension and come to a place that's important. But what we're discussing a lot in our universes, and I really credit the Interfaith Center of New York so much for that, is how do we lead religiously in a time in which the government is actually not supportive of our religious lives, which exists in many places in the world. And because of the Constitution here in the United States, this is the first time in human history that Jews have been protected by the government in which we live. The first time, that First Amendment is the first time there has been a government which has said a minority religion has to be treated with the equal respect of a majority religion. And I would say that the increased sense of vulnerability that the Jewish community feels is watching both this amendment issue and the tax implications and the erosion of the First Amendment in general, and the Orwellian sense that Trump uses language of freedom of speech at the same time that he's actually targeting people for using freedom of speech. And I do think that as religious leaders, we have to be in the forefront of marking a new way forward. And that new way forward is going to require muscles we have not exercised enough, and imagination that we have not exercised enough. And I'm thrilled to be in a room in which we can engage in these conversations and figure out what the path forward is while we deeply understand what the real dangers are, and they are big. One last thing I want to say about the Johnson Amendment. I find it somewhat peculiar that this is named for, of course, LBJ, who was a Texan, a Southerner, and deeply a part of that Southern Democrats of the 50s. And this was done, of course, in 54. By the way, not controversial, right? As far as those of you who know the history much better, when this was done. And now we have a New Yorker named Donald Trump, who is really threatening the very fabric of what has been at the core of encouraging religion to be both a force for good and also receive this profound benefit. So we're in troubled times, and it's going to be a time of great anxiety. And I think that there are going to be times that we're going to have to step up in new ways that we couldn't have predicted. And it's really going to take these kinds of gatherings of people of different kinds of expertise to both chart in detail what the dangers are and to join together in figuring out a way forward. So thank you for being here. And I have a lot more to say, but we'll open it up to the conversation.
Thank you very much. Just a couple of very quick comments about that. I'm interested that what Rabbi Sharon raised the question of donors to 501c3s. I don't know, could they be that material support? I don't know. Yeah, let's think about that. But I think
It will definitely cause a lot of issues for them personally,
Yeah.
right? Because as soon as that exemption goes away, they become taxable on that, that amount that was deductible before, which, penalties and fines. And so, if you're given a little bit, it's not a problem. But if you're given a large amount of money and it causes you serious liabilities down the line, things that can go back 3 years, you're going to think deeply about who you're going to give to. And by the way, there's also a tainting, right? A small amount, a de minimis, anything above a de minimis amount can implicate, and the organization can lose its entire exemption. So if you're a donor, do you then have an obligation to go and figure out every dollar that organization spent to make sure that nothing above that de minimis amount is not going somewhere to, provide material support to a terrorist organization? Yeah.
And considering what you just said about deemed material support and what that could mean given the climate we're in.
right. And just looking back, I guess a year or so. So back in early 2024, Project 2025 became more widely known. And looking at the chilling effect, many not-for-profit organizations, both secular and faith-based, were reluctant to talk about the positions that it recommended, many of which we're now seeing rolled out by the new administration. And I, personally think that their assessment of the exposure to electoral politics was completely wrong. It came from the Heritage Foundation, which is another not-for-profit, and they were all positions. There wasn't any lobbying involved. There wasn't any endorsement of a candidate, but most organizations, at least that my organization reached out to, didn't want to talk about it. So we need more knowledge in the community about how this works. And this now takes us to I want to go back to these First Amendment issues. Ben, I know you're not entirely a First Amendment lawyer, maybe more tax lawyer, but you've looked at this issue for a long time. Do you see this as more than chilling, but actually viewpoint discrimination that HR 9495 would bring?
In thinking about this panel, I really am having trouble kind of keeping up with the connection of the rhetoric on the terror supporting organization bill. So it seems to me that it is just an attempt to engage in viewpoint discrimination. But I'm really not an expert on this bill. I mean, what it's doing is it's introducing a broader set of laws to go after a thing that already in the law you can go after. In other words, providing material support to a terrorist organization is illegal, and nonprofits can't provide material support to a terrorist organization. This law shifts who makes determinations, changes the balance of what kind of due process you have in making determinations, and then it tracks way up the donation line the culpability for that. So it allows the government to in effect take away tax-exempt status up the line of donations, and lots of donations go through all sorts of steps. And so it sort of dramatically could have the effect of chilling donations, even if it has a more robust set of due process than we think. Because if you're a private foundation, for example, now you have to be worried about the organization that you're giving to, that's giving to, et cetera, if you're kind of doing anything that could interact with terror supporting organizations. And because of the way designations about terror supporting organizations work under the current administration, our terror supporting organizations are largely certain types of organizations. So it's really, for me, I would really like to defer to Mr. Jemal on the expertise on the particulars of that bill. But I can speak to Johnson Amendment stuff if that now would be a good time to do that.
Sure. Yes, please.
Great. Okay. So I wanted to say, kind of in response to Rabbi Kleinbaum, or just inspired by that, there's an irony here in the Johnson Amendment space. And part of it is caused by the fact that the political rhetoric, and especially Trump's political rhetoric about the Johnson Amendment, is extremely disconnected from the actual policy problems in the Johnson Amendment. So Trump, even in his first term, was running on the idea that he would smash the Johnson Amendment. And if you smashed the Johnson Amendment, if the Johnson Amendment went away, then the immediate effect was all political contributions would flow through 501c3 organizations. I could set up a 501c3 organization tomorrow. You would donate on a tax-deductible basis, and then we would just funnel that money. We could funnel it directly to campaigns. We could funnel it anywhere. So that's what would happen if you smashed the Johnson Amendment. But Trump's rhetoric relied on the idea that both he and the people who were listening to him understood the Johnson Amendment to have this very specific partisan effect. That is, it silences conservative churches who want to lend support to Trump. In the world of religious organizations, that's a tiny, tiny slice. And in the world of nonprofits, Johnson Amendment applies to all charities. That's a tiny, tiny sliver, but that's where all the rhetoric is. So Trump promised to smash the Johnson Amendment. In his first term, he signed an executive order. He said about it, I did it. I smashed the Johnson Amendment. And that just shows either he really, really fundamentally misunderstood the language of his own executive order, which changed nothing effectively about the Johnson Amendment, or he was lying, like one of those two things. So the political rhetoric about the Johnson Amendment implies that, or is based on the idea that a narrow sliver of conservative religious organizations really want to stop being persecuted by the government when they get involved in politics. This exact delicate dance that Rabbi Kleinbaum is talking about, which is when you're a faith leader, what can you say and what can't you say? And is the government over-chilling your speech? All of that stuff is caricatured. The actual policy problem, how do you figure out how to play that dance, how to permit faith leaders to have the authority and to not fear persecution, or not fear legal persecution at least, for saying the things, the religiously motivated things that they need to say that often have to do with the qualifications of candidates? How do you empower them to do that without creating this terrible loophole, this terrible flaw in the funding of campaigns? And that line, how do you do that? There's some pretty responsible conservatives who I disagree with, but who are kind of trying to get that line a little more right. I think they're going to get it a bunch more wrong. I have ideas about how you get that line a little more right. But that's that policy discussion is much more subtle than the way this kind of unhinged political rhetoric works.
Can I jump in on the political rhetoric too of the Johnson Amendment? So
Absolutely, Tiffany. I was also going to ask you to talk a little bit about one of the, I guess, fact sheets that your organization has on political activity.
right,
Yeah.
yeah, absolutely. So couple things I wanted to mention what Rabbi Kleinbaum mentioned about kind of this it being named after LBJ. So you know, this is why we don't actually want to use the term Johnson Amendment anymore, because it's confusing. We have Speaker Johnson now. It was named after then Senator Johnson before he was even president, and as she mentioned, it wasn't even, you know, controversial whenever it was introduced. But to the point of this was something that has been used as a tool to say, oh, this was created by that Democrat, right? And now the Republicans are using it as a, you know, whenever they call it the Johnson Amendment, it has that little bit of a tinge in it, in the language being used by itself. So that's why we're trying to get away from it and use nonprofit nonpartisanship, but it's a mouthful and it's confusing, and that's why Ben was saying he uses the term out of 501c3 as well. So like that in of itself shows how difficult it is to talk about this as a policy, right? To Ben's point, which is that whenever President Trump signed this executive order, I completely agree, it didn't do anything. It is in statute, so it would have to take an act of Congress to be removed, which they have tried to do that. Going back to Speaker Johnson, current Speaker Johnson has tried to remove it legislatively. So there is this push and pull when it comes to the policies that it affects. But when they tried to remove it in the 2017 tax law, there was a scoring done, and it was billions of dollars that would have been flowing, that would be tax deductible donations that could be used for things like political ads, right? Imagine all the political ads that you're probably still watching right now, and every single one of those political ads could now be a tax deductible donation by the creator of those political ads. So that is using what we see as charitable, which should be charitable resources, should be charitable focus, could be used for political partisan speech. And that's why we are so against some kind of weakening of the Johnson Amendment or nonprofit nonpartisanship. So we do have fact sheets. We have the history of where the 2017 tax law was. We have the executive order that was signed. That's still in effect. So we're talking about all these other executive orders. President Trump did rescind a bunch of executive orders in his first couple of days. This one's still on the books, but it doesn't really do anything. Even the Department of Justice at the time said that it's just saying you can't enforce it unfairly against, to what your point was, and specifically religious and houses of worship, but they weren't doing that to begin with. So it doesn't really do anything anyway. So the Department of Justice itself said that it doesn't have a whole lot of effect. But we do have a lot of these fact sheets and historical records on our website. We also at the time had a sign-on letter of more than 4,000 nonprofits that were trying to protect the Johnson Amendment. And there was a sign-on letter of over 50, I believe. 4,000 faith leaders signed on saying that they wanted to protect it for exactly what Rabbi Kleinbaum was saying, was that we're trying to keep the cultural and political, outside political, small p parts of this conversation separate from what we see as like a tax exemption under 501c3.
Thank you. And I will again commend these fact sheets on your website, which will walk you through the question of what kind of political speech is possible even within the current version of the Johnson Amendment, and questions like, can a leader of the organization have speech separate from the organization, which is something, frankly, I face a lot in my organization. Cool. So we haven't talked about one of the sort of, maybe this is the elephant in the room, I don't know, herd of elephants in the room. What's been going on with attempts to penalize universities for, I guess we could say, unpopular speech and practices. whether it's DEI or recognizing the First Amendment rights of their students to protest on unpopular issues. So, have any thoughts about that, Musa?
I mean, I would say it is really interesting that there's a lot of things that seem settled in our law that are being relitigated. Sometimes they're, it seems like the administration is just pushing the line to see if they could get different results. But I think, especially with Mark Rubio, he was saying, something about being aligned with American foreign policy. The fact that you could deviate from that could be, an issue. And so, especially with this, HR 9495 coming through, and just the jargon that's being passed around. Now, obviously, a charitable organization should not support terrorism. I don't know if anybody is anywhere in America that disagrees with that, right? But I think the question is, who gets to determine, who's providing material support, to terrorism? So, for example, just to take, an extreme hypothetical, because some people do say it. If you take, a lot of the students at Columbia, for example, that are protesting, some people would just say it. Those are terrorists, right? So if we, assuming arguendo here, right, hypothetical, if we say that is a terrorist organization, is Colombia then providing material support by providing a space for them to protest? No. So those are the kind of things that we're getting into. So, it affects, churches, universities, mosques. There's a lot of different organizations that it affects. But I don't think, the issue so much is that we disagree on fundamentals. We all agree on the fundamentals here. But the question is, who has the power to determine those things? And so, in a political system like the U.S., which has a lot of checks and balances, the whole purpose is so that you don't have the authoritarian authority to just say something and force everybody to come with you. The checks and balances are for that purpose. And so, yeah, just like Benjamin said, under Internal Revenue Code Section 501P, the president could simply write an executive order and just reference, an Immigration Act, and you're designated a terrorist organization, right? But they're saying that creates too much bureaucratic hurdles, and they just want the Secretary of the Treasury to just be able to deem it. Seems already fast to me with the executive order, but that's my opinion. That's kind of the issues with it.
Right. And I could add to that if Congress is going to go with HR 9495, why couldn't the next one be on some other unpopular issue? And
we are seeing that there's actually about a handful, maybe even a dozen state bills now introduced at the state level that are doing similar things as well, especially whenever it comes to foreign funding for whether it's on a ballot measure or who gets to decide, to the lobbying and advocacy conversation. Like, we're seeing this at all levels of government now, and now we're seeing it into different pieces. So to what Musa was saying, the conversations at the higher ed level, and we're seeing it in healthcare, we're seeing it in hospitals, and how can they, chip away at different benefits that charitable nonprofits receive because they don't agree with the language that's being used from that specific organization or that subsector.
I'd like to add to that. I think part of what makes it very difficult for those of us who are just basically sentient, is that there's such a broad approach to these things, because exactly as you described, when there's a lot of checks and balances, things have the time and the process to be able to get some nuance. So by saying all protests X, Y, or Z also removes the possibility to be able to be in a position to say, well, some things have stepped over the line and some things haven't, but we have to be able to have the ability to distinguish. And right now, the energy and the impact of what these policies will say is that there's no nuance and there's no difference between one thing or the other. And that is bringing us into this very, very dangerous place where all protest becomes designated as terrorist as opposed to being able to distinguish. And that's real. And then we on our side also need to end up doing some of the same thing by saying it's all okay and not being able to say, well, they're distinguishing the features that we want to be able to advocate for also. But, and the ability to be able to do that is what courts of law, lawyers, and all of you folks here are trained to do, to be able to make these distinctions and to apply the law, and then to have appeal processes and have the government or the whichever this have to provide actual evidence and have that evidence actually debated and discussed. That's pretty terrifying that somebody can deem something without any of those very cumbersome processes. We all agree. And some of us have been, caught up in some of those cumbersome processes and recognize that, oh, this is ridiculous. But there's a way that it has kept us moving forward as a society, those cumbersome legal processes.
Yes.
Can I,
Yeah, go ahead.
can I address this, this kind of, maybe you called it the elephant in the room about the assault on universities. So since we're sitting in a law school and I teach at a law school, and we just referenced like the kind of thinking that lawyers are trained to do or try to do, the fundamentals of the way that lawyers are trained to think is to really try to think about the kind of structures of legal institutions, and how can those structures of legal institutions bear the weight of the questions that are directed at them. And part of that is to try to distinguish between good laws and the kind of partisan intent of anyone. And one of the things that's so confusing about the political rhetoric right now is that Trump and the kind of Trump rhetoric, the Trump administration rhetoric, it's so directed at, it's so unapologetic at the idea that it's kind of weaponizing government against particular ideas. In other words, the rhetoric really elicits this idea that it's just content discrimination. Whether it actually turns out to be that or not, will come to be seen. But the rhetoric itself is very chilling. It makes you afraid. So like, the Dear Colleague letter about DEI, it just had one sentence about whether your curriculum teaches that structural racism is a thing. You can't teach about the tax code and say like, oh, I'm not going to mention structural racism. Like there's just no way to be inquisitive about what's happening in the structures if you kind of if somehow someone told you that the way that the laws impact race is somehow now off the table. It's just absurd. And it's absurd to think that the government has the authority to do that. It could invest in a grant to talk about racism, and it could tell you that it wanted one outcome, but it can't hinge all of its funding on whether the curriculum or whether your classes talk about something as fundamental question as that. So the partisan rhetoric, but there's this irony in the First Amendment stuff where Johnson Amendment is a great example. The conservative rhetoric has been, we're afraid that the government is discriminating against conservatives, so we want to empower organizations, nonprofits, to be independent of government. We want to protect them. That's what this kind of First Amendment values are about. Protect them from the influence of government. Government, kind of stay out of this. Let us talk about politics more, is the Johnson Amendment example. Or let us blah, 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 blah. But then obviously the actual policies of this administration are exactly the opposite. They're saying, hey, we don't like a whole lot of institutions that we feel like are saying things that we don't agree with. So let's maximize the weaponization of government in order to try to chill or even punish those kinds of ideas. And the reality is, like, if you want to kind of think structurally about the law, you got to kind of just look one level lower than what's actually happening. And it's a hard thing to do. And it seems like a pointless thing to do sometimes.
Well, thank you. I think I completely agree with everything you said there, Ben. Just one more question for the panel, then I'm going to open it up. So we're hearing all these scary things that could happen to not-for-profits in the not-for-profit sector. And again, to emphasize what Musa told us, there's a 3-year look back to see if your organization has, over the past 3 years, been a material support to a terrorist organization. So, scrubbing your website now, okay, that's prospective, but it doesn't erase the past. What can we do to help protect not-for-profits? In particular, I think we're a group of lawyers as well as state leaders. Tiffany, tell us what we can do.
I mean, we are telling people to call their members of Congress, and you as attorneys and professionals have, a specific view of the work that's being done and how important it is to protect nonprofits in the tax code. I mean, they're trying to rewrite the tax code right now. So what Ben was just saying, which is the structure of the tax code, making sure that the structure remains the same and calling your member of Congress to do that. You have the right to do that. You have the ability to do that. And you can do it in your individual capacity and have a say. The other thing is, as attorneys, we filed a lawsuit. We filed 2 lawsuits. There are a lot of attorneys that are very, very involved in fighting back some of these weakening aspects of it, whether it's the Johnson Amendment or something else. Whatever your issue is, we were just discussing yesterday, I was on a call with, about 40 nonprofit leaders, that there isn't a single section of the nonprofit sector that's not being attacked right now for one reason or another. Whatever your passion is, whatever your subject is that you care about, personally, privately, separately from, being a law student or being an attorney, get involved, because there are lots of opportunities to do that, to, provide your pro bono resources or not. You could even charge for it, but there are ways to do that. There are over 100 lawsuits right now, and they're looking for some research and they're looking for some more time. So I think that's one of the best uses of your trained professional abilities that other groups don't have.
Any thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I would just say, we're in the midst of historical times, and that's what history's made out of. And so, now is the time to kind of double the effort and step up.
Ben, any thoughts? And then I'm gonna.
No, I think I don't have anything to add to what Musa and Tiffany said. I think that covers it.
Well, I have a very different perspective, obviously, since I'm not a tax lawyer, which is we have to figure out how we're going to protect our souls for a very, very long, difficult future. And it's going to go in this area and in many areas. And what we have to do is not give up or give in and keep moving forward. And history has shown us, and contemporary societies in other parts of the world show us today, we have to build a worldwide resistance movement globally of people who care about a future that's different than our current present right now, including these details and moving into the big picture. And it starts with caring about our fellow human beings. And that's where we are. We're going to have to develop a very long range process, caring about each other and moving forward to build towards a future that it might be possible that none of us in this room will see. Does that mean it's less important for us to fight as hard as we can every single day? So we're building a foundation so that in 100 years, when there are people living in that future that we've tried to make possible with the foundation we're building now, we'll look back on us and say, we didn't give up, we kept moving forward, and we weren't deterred in our own work and our own lives, and we didn't give up or give in. And that's what's going to be our challenge, which is, I don't have the tax code issues. I have the, God code issues. And that's what's going to take. We're in this for a long haul. This is not going away quickly. And it's going to take us to imagine our significance in making a future possible.
Inspiration. I want to add a very tiny thing before we throw things open to questions. And this relates a little bit to what Ed said in the last panel. All organizations need lawyers and also people of faith. So one way that you can take the fight in a direction that also involves community, because we are stronger when we're together, is to volunteer to serve on a board or a committee of an organization whose work you support, whether it's a religious institution or something on the secular side. And I think we have a lot of law students here, but something that we try to teach our law students, that they can make a difference there, and don't wait until you've got gray hair.
Yeah.
Okay, we'll throw this open.
And if I can just remind the questioners to be as succinct as possible in your questions, so we'll get to more of them.
Thank you. I am a interfaith activist of Muslim faith. I have a scenario which is partly true and partly didactical. I run an organization, and this is hypothetical. I run an organization, and we all know that the Hezbollah leader, Nasrullah, was killed many, many months ago. But in the Muslim tradition, we can hold a funeral prayer for him anywhere in the world at any time. And it's a communal prayer. So if a communal prayer for the deceased is held in New York, and I, as the leader of nonprofit, go and attend that funeral prayer asking God for forgiveness for the deceased soul, where do I stand? Am I supporting the mission of this person who had died, or I'm just performing my religious duty? And where does my organization stand?
That's an amazingly good question. Okay, Musa.
Yeah, that's a really good question. You know, if you run an organization and the secretary deems that to be a material support that is in excess of a de minimis amount, you'll have 90 days to prove that it wasn't. So I don't know.
What is the definition of tangible? Does it have to be
Uh,
tangible or no?
I mean, it's not very clear, right? Because this law was passed, you know, in I think 2015. So, legal training, you know, political advice, you know, how much advice that's what the law has to flush out. But again, you know, when this law was passed in the House of Representatives, the discussions included intangible. So, you know, I mean, I don't know. I mean, if you give a speech and it's very rousing, does that cross the line? I don't know.
Or if your organization collects money to pay for the event, or uses that event as a focus of fundraising, I think you may be in.
You mean
danger.
you're using that example because Hezbollah is a designated terrorist organization. So that's not the question. So there's an example of something that is designated. What would a prayer on behalf of its leader mean legally? That's what, yeah.
And can I just say, I mean, this is the obvious. Can I just say the obvious? There is nothing that is more clear from a First Amendment perspective than that praying on behalf of anyone in the world, any historical figure in the world, is protected speech, and that the government cannot punish you for that. That doesn't mean that there isn't a tremendous amount of suffering that the government could cause in pursuing someone who exercised their First Amendment rights. But the fundamental legal structure under the Constitution is extremely clear on this issue of, you know, if you attended a funeral and said a prayer on someone's behalf, that is not material support for a terrorist organization.
And I'm sorry, I'm just going to throw in here, it gets ridiculous with the hypothetical that you gave. If the prayer is to, you know, forgiveness for the diseased soul of this terrorist, if that's your intent, versus we're sorry he was killed because he was a great man. Now, suddenly, whether it's material or not, you have to look at the intent and the type of prayer that's given. It gets ludicrous.
No, I don't. I mean, from
Demonstrate
First
that.
Amendment perspective, it just doesn't matter. Like if I say Adolf Hitler is the greatest man who ever lived, that's core protected speech, no matter what the government's view is of Adolf Hitler's legacy. It doesn't matter if I'm, you know, seeking his forgiveness or lionizing him. That praying is protected speech.
Right, but if suddenly the government's not honoring protected speech and they're drawing these fine
That's why
distinctions
you
on
asked about the
materiality.
So if you, yeah, where does it not become, where is it no longer speech?
Great, scary conversation. Tell me, who gets to define what is a terrorist organization? And what are the limits?
Yeah, so I think in terms of the designation that's going to happen. But I for our purposes, the focus is the supporting of the designated organization. So, for example, Hamas is a terrorist designated organization. If you are to send, charitable things to children in Gaza, and it gets co-opted, by Hamas, did you provide material support? It's really to kind of, make people ask questions where your donations are going, what your connections are.
So maybe I should refine my
It's the
question just a
State
little bit.
Department, isn't it? Who technically, that,
I believe it was the Treasury Department.
what?
Treasury Department.
So
would-
maybe refine my question just a little bit.
Treasury Department. Oh, I thought it was a Secretary of State. Okay, no.
Let's say what happens, okay, I get designated terrorist organizations, but can that scope hypothetically change to domestic terrorism organizations? And how do we define what is a domestic terrorist organization? For example, my foundation does work for in behalf of LGBTQ folks, the queer folks. So could somebody in theory designate us to be a terrorist organization?
In theory, in theory, anything is possible,
Well,
I
just
guess.
Viktor Orban in Hungary on Tuesday had a bill passed in the legislature saying that all gay pride activities are now illegal because they harm children. So if you want to know where America's going, watch Viktor Orban on that particular, not just on that issue, but he's so beloved by, but so there you go. An example. It's not there yet, but by designating it, anything LGBT is harmful to children, then you start to see how the possibilities of the groundwork is. It's not there right now, but there's a way you can see it as a possibility. But the definition now, and that's not new, it's 2015, the terrorist thing. It's not new, this whole thing about designating, and foundations have suffered because of this. Many foundations have to sign a document that says they will not give to any of these terrorist organizations since 2015. Or is it 15? I don't know.
Yeah, at least for this
the-
501, yeah.
So that's not new, this whole idea. The fact that it might get expanded and what that list is knowable, and it's the Secretary of Treasury does that, determines.
Sorry, I wanted to clarify. It's the Secretary of State who, I think, to your point, who decides what is a terrorist, who's a terrorist and the organization. It's the Secretary of Treasury who would determine under HR 9495 who would be supporting. And to what I mentioned earlier is there's dozens of states now, or at least a handful, I think maybe a dozen now, of states that are trying to also provide that authority to state secretaries of state or the attorneys general or whoever is the enforcement arm over charities in that specific state.
I have a question as it pertains to taxation of nonprofit organizations. Sometimes the donations or contributions to these said organizations are embedded in trusts and foundations. So basically, what is the process for taxation? Are these two types of legal entities taxable?
You mean after a designation?
Are you asking if you're giving out of a trust or out of a trust to a charitable organization? That's
Exactly.
that's a donation. That's deductible as well, is my understanding.
So just,
Well, let's talk about a charitable remainder trust, for example.
Yes, charitable remainder trust.
Yeah. The charitable remainder trust that supports a tax exempt organization that now gets designated as terrorist supporting. Does that charitable remainder trust get disqualified?
Wait, I'm sorry, I'm getting a little confused. Is it the charitable remainder trust that is, and admittedly, I'm not the best at a trust and estates law. Benjamin, feel free to jump in if you're better at it than I am.
I mean, I think the question that you're asking is kind of, this is very confusing because you have at the bottom a terrorist organization, and then the thing that this bill is doing is it's allowing the Secretary of the Treasury to designate organizations that are providing material support, and that could be money or that could be something else, is one of the big problems. Designate those as terrorist supporting organizations. And so I think your question is kind of how far up can it go? And my understanding is it can go up as far as any exempt organization. So if you have a trust that is a tax exempt organization that gives money to an organization, that gives money to an organization, that gives money to that even not give money, provides material support for a terrorist supporting organization, it could theoretically go up all the way up the chain, I believe.
Thank you.
Sorry, I just wanted to go back to the prior conversation. And maybe to state the obvious, right? We're not getting any help really from the executive branch. Looks like we're not getting any help from Congress until the midterms. So there's a lot of reliance on grassroots and on the courts. And so I really just wanted to get further elaboration on whether and what the case law is, if there is any. And I acknowledge that we have many tax attorneys and non-attorneys. But if it, to the extent that you know, is there case law on designation of a terrorist organization? Is that challengeable? Is that just defense and therefore the domain, as the court said, it's the domain of the executive? And is there any guidance on supporting a terrorist organization? Because it seems to me, as I said, the courts for the next 2 years are going to be the only place where this is going to play out, because Congress is not interested in checking the desires of this administration at present.
Tiffany, do you jump in on that a little bit?
I mean,
I don't know what the case law is.
I would refer you to a case called Holder versus Humanitarian Law Project. It was a Supreme Court case that basically laid out what a terrorist supporting organization was. And in that case, they basically said those things: monetary contributions, tangible aid, legal training, and political advice. Right. So if in that case, if there's a terrorist organization and you want to represent them politically, and bring them into the UN, for example, to be able to, enter the international arena, that would be providing right. No, okay, I see your question. Yeah. In that case, yeah, in terms of, what is
Nuance.
yeah,
The
I know the
nuance.
nuances are critical. Yeah, in terms of, the designation itself, that is outside my scope. It's not a tax issue necessarily. So, again, it all depends, right? What people determine is a national security threat. And so,
And there's
yeah.
actually, there are several acts that if they're passed, it really gives the president of the United States almost free will to designate somebody an enemy of the state for security reasons. It's and
Scary.
it's really scary. I mean, and so that those haven't been passed yet. But it's not hard to imagine that this president would do it. And it's like what he did with the Alien Act, that he just declares it. And then only the Supreme Court or the Congress could limit it. And it's a little hard to imagine that they would. And then he really would have almost, as I understand it, I'm not a lawyer, but I spend a lot of time thinking about this stuff with people who know about it. He then would have almost free reign under those acts, not under the contemporary legal structure.
Yeah, and especially with presidential power, that is the test. How
Right.
far can the president go? And that's what's being tested.
Yeah, that's what's being tested. Right. So I have a question. My name is Ann Clace. I'm an ethical culture clergy leader, and I'm on the board of my home congregation, the Brooklyn Society for Ethical Culture. We have a board meeting this evening. I'm going to be reporting to them on this. So I guess this is for you, Rabbi, as a question. We've got high anxiety right now, and a lot of tension. And part of it is, and I really appreciated what Emma said in the earlier panel, and we had lobbied together before, so I know her. Sticking clear to our values, and yet feeling the risk of losing our tax exempt status. So I guess it's a question as a congregational leader, and now I'm a board member, sort of, as you know, we're supposed to be the non-anxious presence. So how does one maintain the non-anxious presence in a congregation where we're hearing different voices saying, we must speak up, we must say something, and then if we don't exist, then we can't do good things. That's exactly that tension that I referred to. It's a big one. It's real. The first thing is that up until this particular regime, presidency, it's been really much more clear than a lot of faith leaders have wanted to accept, which is you can speak out about policies. You could speak about political issues. Your First Amendment rights don't go away. And as an individual, I've always interpreted it as when I'm not speaking on behalf of a synagogue, I haven't lost my First Amendment rights because if I'm not speaking on their behalf, I can even go into electoral politics. Not everybody is comfortable with that, but it's been pretty clear that while there might be cultural limitations, and that's what I meant within a specific religious community about what's okay to hear about or talk about, it's really, as far as I have understood it and I have practiced, there are no limits politically if you stay out of the sphere of endorsement or that. So there's a lot to talk about without talking about that right now, right? The question we all have is, where are things going? And as Tim Snyder said, I really believe you can't anticipate and comply in advance. Right now, the way the law is set up, as I understand, and I have a lot of lawyers here could correct me, there are really no legal limits to denouncing policies or right now from a pulpit. And if that ultimately will get challenged, that's not a reason now to shut ourselves down. However, I would recommend process-wise, get some of those sheets bring some sheets that are in legal terms, not religious terms, that say that. And there are many. And the National Council of Nonprofits has excellent ones. And most of our denominations basically take that and then just add a little religion in it to make it sound like. But really bring some of the expertise, because right now, as far as I understand, and I'll get corrected, there are really no limits on what you can say from a pulpit about the political situation and policies right now. Can somebody correct me if that's wrong?
No, I think that that's right. And can I just add, just from the perspective of being a tax lawyer, is that if like an administration wants to weaponize an agency to carry out its agenda, the IRS is actually a very, very difficult agency to weaponize in that way. And it's even more difficult to weaponize the IRS if you're simultaneously very aggressively disempowering the IRS by cutting all of its resources. So it's actually a very hard, conservatives have been saying for years that the IRS was weaponized against conservative organizations. And it's just not true. They created a scandal off of a kind of mistake that the IRS made, but it's extremely difficult for the president to use nonprofit status, which is enforced by the IRS, against nonprofit organizations. Now, an exception to that actually is this proposed law that we've been talking about, where the Secretary of the Treasury can directly designate. In those cases, because the authority is kind of centralized in the top political figure, the possibility of using that for political ends is easier. But in terms of generally revoking tax-exempt status, especially from religious organizations for whatever conduct they engage in, and I completely agree with the rabbi that it is not political speech that you are not allowed to engage in. It's just this very narrow band of endorsing a candidate for public office. But even there, it's very hard for the IRS to be weaponized in an effective way against religious organizations. And it's contrary to what has traditionally been the view on the right, which is government should keep your hands off of religious organizations, especially, but all nonprofits who engage even in this core political speech, this endorsement speech.
And it's almost impossible to find a church which is against anti-abortion in a very, very aggressive way that doesn't give out paper to every congregant in a moment of election that says, this is what the two candidates stand for. Vote for the one who is against abortion. I mean, they go to a line that I have to say Jews are very nervous about, which I keep saying, relax a little bit. You know, it's so they don't say, and they won't say, I endorse so-and-so, but they'll say, support the candidate that supports this position. That's how far, and that nobody's gotten into trouble for that, as far as I know. I mean, they've even gotten that far.
No, but
again,
that actually probably is a technical violation. But
Yeah,
I don't really
that is
suing
probably
anyone
too
for doing anything, but the facts that you just described probably is a
I have
technical
a
violation.
leaflet that said, our religious community opposes abortion, and here are the positions that these two candidates take. Would that,
Well, you can just oppose the position of abortion and not get into who's taking which position as the candidate. But just a reminder that once you're elected, you're no longer a candidate for public office.
I meant to say that before. Donald Trump is not running, please God, for office. So that's a matter of, that's not an electoral politics anymore. Despite what he said, is what others around him say, but we're not in an election.
That's correct.
it could still be lobbying though, but it's okay lobbying.
Well, lobbying is also,
And
you're allowed to lobby, which
You're allowed.
just institutions, it's pretty hard to hit up against that percentage. We do so many other things. It's just, but yes, that's, yeah.
You just have to keep track of it.
And we have resources on that too on our website if you need it.
It's a great website.
And I think we're out of time, so we have to leave it there. And I just want to thank Anne and all of our panelists.
Thank you so much.
Again, I want to echo the importance of speaking, having these conversations across professional or sector divides. Like I love, 4 tax attorneys and a rabbi equals, I think, a really rich, important conversation. So thank you all so much.